Welcome everyone. This is our second module on land reforms. In this module, we shall try to focus on number 1, finding the ways of how to categorize land reforms. Secondly, we shall try to categorize the land reform experiences across countries. So let us start our analysis by asking a question: how to categorize the land reform process? Various economists have categorized land reforms in various ways. Let us start with the categorization as done by Elias H. Tauma. According to Tauma, there are two types of land reforms, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 reforms are gradual in nature. In those reforms, agriculture is assumed to play only a secondary role. Industry is assumed to play the major role in the economic activities. The reform aimed at reduction but not elimination of poverty. Democratic institutions were set up to maintain checks and balances. As a result, these reforms are partial in nature and fail to remove any differentiation and instability in the society. On the other hand, type 2 reforms are comprehensive in nature. They give equal emphasis on agriculture and industry. They eliminate tenancy, create an egalitarian society, and at the same time, agricultural production is organized on a large-scale collective basis. Type 2 reforms ensure a stable social and political order. Shoban categorized land reform processes into 3 types. Type 1 reforms are reforms that originate from social upheavals. They aim at social transition and elimination of social differentiation, thereby creating an egalitarian society. Type 2 reforms, on the other hand, are reform programs that aim at transition towards equality but keep the scope for some differentiation in the rural society. What are type 3 reforms? Type 3 reforms are those reform processes that takes place without realizing a social transition in the rural society. They are only egalitarian in nature. According to Shoban, successful reforms can be achieved only through radical egalitarian reforms. According to Ronald J. Herring, for a successful reform, we need full social transition. Land should be transferred, according to him, to the tillers of the soil. Ownership of land must belong to the operators of land. According to him, anything less than that will be at most partial. Powelson and Stock, they opined that mode of initiation and implementation of the whole process of land reform determines the effectiveness of the land reform process. For reform to be successful, it must originate from the grassroots level. Peasants must initiate the land reform process. Any reform imposed from above will appear only as reform by grace and will only have a short-term impact. However, the most comprehensive analysis of land reform categorization was done by Bandopadhyay. According to Bandopadhyay, reforms have two types of components, a normative component and an empirical component. What is a normative component? Normative component actually deals with the ideology of the reform process. This ideology is transferred into the policy model by the reformers. The policy model shapes the objective of the proposed reforms. According to her, failure of reform actually indicates a gap between the normative and the empirical components of reforms. This gap, according to her, may engender due to a number of factors. In some cases, the ideology may be too high, unrealistic, and unachievable. In some cases, failure may be due to failure in implementation, which actually creates a gap in the achievement. Now, keeping into mind these ideas, let us move to our next question. What are the factors that determine the success and failure of land reforms? According to Bandopadhyay, the factors that influence land reforms can be categorized into 8 types. Number 1, the initial situation and conditions necessitating reforms. Number 2, the authority initiating reforms. Number 3, the purpose of reforms. Number 4, the approach followed. Number 5, the method and coverage. Number 6, instruments adopted. Number 7, implementation and peasant participation. And number 8, the post-reform structure and social change. Let us now move to the factors one by one. Regarding the initial conditions, actually initial impetus of reforms can come from two sources, external or internal. At the same time, there can be a combination of the two sources. The external sources include war, foreign invention and intervention, colonization and decolonization. On the other hand, internal sources can originate from inefficiencies in the structure of production and relations of production. Regarding purpose, approach, method and coverage, the purposes generally fall under two categories. A, objectives aiming at productive efficiency, and B, objectives aiming at achieving social justice. Methods can be divided into two categories, drastic, revolutionary, and slow, evolutionary. Coverage can be either total and comprehensive or selective and partial. Regarding instruments, instruments can be of two types. Number 1, instruments for removing social deficiencies like exploitative relations and inequality in possession of productive assets. Secondly, instruments for correcting and mitigating deficiencies within the same structural system. This may include removal of arbitrary rent fixation and guarantee of some amount of security in terms of continuity in tenancy. Regarding implementation, implementation is actually the most crucial aspect of all reform programs. Enacting reform laws and prescribing the end to achieve are the most crucial part of the reform programs. The success of reform depends on its proper and timely implementation. Time is actually an important factor. Quick implementation is essential for successful reforms. Slow implementation gives ample scope for dilution and re-emergence of vested interests, thus generating further differentiation. And lastly, the post-reform structure. Post-reform reorganization and management ensure retainability of the new land structure and prevent future possible disturbances created by the demographic and market forces. Given this eightfold classification, we now move to our next question: how can we categorize land reform experiences across developing countries? Now, the question is, how can we categorize land reform experiences across developing countries? In this regard, Bandopadhyay talked about an eightfold classification. The first classification is revolutionary, comprehensive, and socialistic. This type of land reform was experienced by three countries, namely China, Vietnam, and Cuba. In these countries, land reforms were radical and revolutionary. They aimed at distributive justice. The reform processes were authoritarian but non-military. In China and Vietnam, land reform emerged from a Communist Party-led revolution. In case of Cuba, land reform was initiated by bourgeois-led insurgency. In all the three countries, ceiling imposition was followed by land distribution combined with tenancy reforms. And all the three countries experienced a comprehensive land reforms. The second category is revolutionary, partial, and socialistic. These happened in case of Mexico, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. How was the reforms? The reforms were partly radical, partly evolutionary, aiming at distributive justice and generating from a new regime. However, the gradual nature of the reform process, absence of a comprehensive approach, limited coverage, and various exemptions led to only partial success of the reform process. The third category of reform is non-socialistic and comprehensive. This happened in the case of four countries, namely Ethiopia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. All of them undertook radical reforms aimed at distributive justice. For all the countries, the land reform measure was successful. However, there were some country specific features. For example, in Ethiopia, the ceiling redistribution scheme focused on the amount of land available. In the country, the amount of land available actually decided the land retention ceiling rather than the number of beneficiaries needing land as done in other countries. For the case of Japan, it was observed that Japan succeeded in building a modern, developed non-agricultural sector to support the growing agrarian population and sustained the benefit of the reformed structure. The fourth category is of regime-induced reforms that were partial in nature. This occurred in three countries, Peru, Egypt and Iraq. In all the three countries, the reforms were initiated by military power and the redistribution was military power induced redistribution. What was the impact of the reforms in these countries? In all countries, the approach was partial and uneven, leaving a large number of rural households land poor or landless. Secondly, inequality was marginally reduced but not eliminated. So, the entire reform process was partial in nature. In category 5, regime-induced reform, which is partial in nature but non-military. This happened in countries like Syria, Iran, Chile, Venezuela and Colombia. In these countries, the reform was regime-induced and redistributive. In terms of impact, what we can say is like this. Firstly, high ceiling level, high retention limits and several exemption clauses led to limited success of the reform process in all these countries. In Iran, the growth of oil production and emphasis on efficiency led to the reversal of the reform process. In category 6 lies the countries where the land reform was related to decolonization, direct involvement and quick withdrawal. These happened in case of three countries, Algeria, Mozambique and Angola. In these countries, colonial authorities were involved directly in the agrarian production structure. So, the colonial authorities were directly involved in the land reform process. What was the result? Dual structure continued in spite of some amount of redistribution obtained by the Algerian reform programs. For the other countries, state farms of Mozambique and Angola could not achieve the same level of performance and were not as successful as the Algerian state farms. Category 7 relates to decolonization, direct involvement but gradual withdrawal. These happened in three countries, Kenya, Zimbabwe and Tunisia. In these countries, reforms were related to gradual decolonization and was distributive. In Kenya, there was limited success owing to government's concern about the productive efficiency of the family or corporate run capitalist enterprises. This in turn means that the governments of these countries were more concerned about the efficiency than the redistributive aspects. What about Zimbabwe? Zimbabwe did not face acute redistributional problem. However, the most productive pocket belonged to the British people and were under large-scale capitalist farming. This hampered the redistributive process at least partially. In Tunisia, the dualistic structure with all the accompanied evils continued nullifying the limited reform efforts in selected pockets. The eighth category is decolonization, indirect involvement. These happened in South Asian countries like India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. At the same time, some Southeast Asian countries like Philippines, Thailand and Indonesia also experienced this type of reform. These type of reforms were redistributive in nature, but the colonial leaders were not involved in the land distribution process or the land reform process. However, though these reforms were redistributive in nature, the influence of landed power survived. Land limits were diluted and subsequently increased. The coverage was less. The embedded bureaucracy and an administrative machinery totally aloof to the peasant beneficiaries diluted the reform efforts. So, apart from the two comprehensive categories, most of the reform processes resulted into only partial success. So, we have briefly discussed the land reform experiences of 29 countries spread over various continents. The analysis suggests that along with initial conditions, several factors influence the land reform process. Even under a socialistic framework, land reform may bring limited success. A successful land reforms needs to be backed by sincere effort from policy imposing authorities, and the reform process needs to be radical. Otherwise, as our analysis suggests, exploration of loopholes at various levels will limit the success of the land reform program. Since the early 20th century, land reform was a popular policy agenda as it fits the ambitious goal to bring about economic development by a way of state intervention. Land reform being a big push to be conceived and implemented by the state as guardian or manager of national development. However, if we think about land reform in current days, it needs to be remembered that the perception about land reforms has changed over time. It has been realized that the top-down initiatives caused by the land reform programs miss out certain important developments. It also fails to enlist certain support from the relevant actors. Therefore, today the term land reforms is commonly used to refer colonization programs on publicly owned land, land registration, consolidation of fragmented holdings, tenancy improvement, and land taxation in addition to redistribution. At the same time, now focus is also given on community based strategies. So, this is what we have in this module. Regarding the question that what we have learned from this module, we can briefly discuss it in this way. We have learned that land reform process across countries can be categorized into various ways. So, various economists have done it in various methods. We have learnt about them. We have also learned that each categorization depends on a number of factors. Depending on the factors as well as on the initial conditions, we also observed that we can club the reform experience of the developing countries into 8 categories. We have talked about the 8 categories and the countries that were involved in each of the categories. So, this is what we have in this module. Thanks for watching.